India. The project works towards realizing feminist visions of the digital in society by exploring and addressing power imbalances in the areas of norms, governance, and infrastructure in India and beyond. Anja's research and advocacy currently focuses on questions regarding data governance, surveillance, and cybersecurity, and regarding freedom of expression, including work on gender, bodies, surveillance, data valence, and gender and online abuse. She has also conducted extensive research on the architecture of internet governance. Anja has been a member of the investment committee of the Digital Defenders Partnership and of the steering committee of Best Bits, a global network of civil society members, and is currently a member of the board of governors of Veris One. She has worked as an international consultant on internet issues, including for the Independent Commission on Multilateralism and United Nations Development Program Asia Pacific, as well as the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, Mr. Frank LaRue. Prior to focusing her work on the information society, Anja researched and consulted on a wide range of development-related issues. She has lectured at the University of East Anglia, Norwich, UK, and the Ambedkar University in Delhi, as well as having guest lectured at universities in India and Brazil. She has conducted extensive fieldwork throughout South Asia. She obtained her PhD in development studies from the University of East Anglia in the UK. Today, Anja will speak about what the possible harms of data use are and how those can only be curtailed if we fundamentally reassess how we think about data. Over to you, Anja.
Thank you also for having me here. That's a great pleasure. To start, I wanted to make two qualifications though. The first one is that despite that very long introduction on my accomplishments, I'm actually not going to talk so much about the donor framework as such. It's not something that we have focused on that much so far. Most of the work at the Internet Democracy Project has been around questions of data governance more generally, and so that will be the starting point of what I'm going to talk about. The second thing I just wanted to flag is that I'm a bit under the weather today, so if I'm faltering in between, please forgive me, this is why. All right, so to start, I think if we just look at, start from the question of why donors are actually increasingly asking for more and more data, I think that's because they are following a growing trend. First of all, because they can, and secondly, because they somehow believe that it enables them greater control, in part because somehow more data is believed to tell more truth. When we talk about the dangers of collecting more data, we usually focus on privacy. I think that's by now the most common debate that we actually see play out in, for example, the media. But actually, the potential harms of data collection and use are much greater, and they include questions of autonomy, of dignity, of equality and non-discrimination. Seeing that we don't have that much evidence from donor practices in any case yet, as they often tend to keep their data private, let's maybe look at some of the government uses of data to fight the pandemic at the moment to get a bit of a sense of what these harms might be. First of all, for example, when data is made public or when it simply falls in the hands of the wrong people, it can actually lead to exacerbating the stigma for groups that are already vulnerable. We've seen that, for example, in India, where the names of people who have been quarantined were published on the internet, and these people then faced persecution by neighbors, harassment, etc. Another example is when data is manipulated, skewed in manners that are fairly unscientific but very common, this can really do the same thing. We saw that, for example, with the Tablighi Jamaat incident. There was a lot of media attention for how supposedly The event in New Delhi was one of the super spreaders in India. But while we know the proportion of positive cases linked to Tablighi Jamaat at that point in time, what we don't know is how many of the total cases tested were actually people from Tablighi Jamaat. And as long as we don't have access to that figure either, any news about how does a supposedly a super spreader hotspot is simply unreliable. A third harm I want to highlight is when data is taken at face value, context is removed, and that's also often really dangerous. In the context of the lockdown, we've seen, for example, that drones have been used in certain areas to police the lockdown, and where people have violated the lockdown. In some cases, they have been slapped with FIRs, etc. But if this is your response and if this is how you read the data, what you will not get into is why the people who are violating the lockdown are actually out on the streets. And as we have seen in the case of the migrants, when they have to choose between hunger and illness, since hunger is most acute, most people decide to fight hunger first. What we've also seen then is that they've actually moved to traveling at night when they were trying to get home, for example, precisely to evade police surveillance, including by drones. Another example of where context disappears is when you use the Arogya Setu app at the moment, or in any case, with any app, it will be like that. It allows you to see if you are in the vicinity of somebody who has been infected. But what the app can't see, of course, is whether or not there has been a wall in between the two of you. And so whether the proximity necessarily indicates in a case of infection or a high risk for yourself. At the moment, it's not fully clear what happens when you come in the proximity of somebody who has been infected when you are a user of the app. And there is some public debate about it. But in case it does trigger an automatic alarm to the government, just imagine the number of supposedly infected cases that will be flagged incorrectly, so false positives. All these use cases are, of course, different from what donors would face directly, but I think at the heart, the challenges really are similar. We take data because we can, and then we give it enormous power. Because, as I said, we believe it will tell the truth, and among the idealists of us also, I do think we believe it will make the world better, even if that power is completely unjustified. I want to then take a step back and ask really at how did we get here? There are two things to highlight. First of all is that donors are, of course, not the only ones who are asking for more and more data. We are living in a context in which the widespread sharing of data is in any case becoming normalized. Surveillance capitalism companies like Google and Facebook have a really important role in making that seem natural. And in India, certainly the private sector has also had something to do with pushing that in the country. But in the Indian case, the government has perhaps been even more important because it has built the ecosystem around Aadhaar, for example, that makes a lot of this possible. And the question of, say, for example, consent, which becomes so important when one wants to control data use and collection, has been treated in a somewhat cavalier manner in India. If you look at the draft data protection bill that is currently in Parliament, basically the government has allowed itself the right to take our data without our consent across the board, and that's then justified in the name of the benefits one gets in return. But we also see it with Arogya Setu, again, the public interest coming into play as the argument there, where even though user consent for the data that is shared through the app was actually very prominent initially in the debate around privacy in relation to the app, it ended up really being irrelevant as the government and other entities starting to make having that app on your phone obligatory in a growing number of cases. The idea that consent can be so easily overridden really becomes normalized through growing practices like that, including by government agencies. But the second important thing to see, and which at the Internet Democracy Project is actually a big focus of our work at the moment, is why has that happened in the first place, right? And why is it so hard to find arguments to stop this? At the heart of this is really the way we talk about data. Data at the moment is broadly constructed as a resource. It's a layer of information that supposedly sits in everything, and that you can take out of the medium that has generated it without the medium impacting it. Once you've done there, it kind of sits out there, up for grabs, ready to be mined, whoever wants to take it for whatever purpose, more or less that they see fit. This is the dominant discourse across the world, but it doesn't actually match people's experiences in many cases. And this is important to get into deeper. First of all, from the perspective of users of technology, people who live in the digital world. If you speak, for example, with women or people with a queer identity who have been victims of the non-consensual sharing of sexual images, when you ask them about how they experience the harm of that, they do not talk about it in terms of a data protection violation, right? Nobody says my data protection rights have been violated. Even privacy is not mentioned that often. Actually, people often talk about it in terms of sexual assault. So what this example shows is really that the line between our data and our body is blurring so much that really it's starting to become irrelevant. And that has big consequences for how we think about policy. We also see that blurring happening from the side of the state. In India, we have examples in the context of Aadhaar, for example, where we have had news reports of people who go to a ration shop and their fingerprint identification fails, do not get rations and die of starvation. You're standing in front of a ration shop owner who might have known your family for 30 years, but the data, the system doesn't recognize your data. And so even if you say you are who you are and everybody around you believes that you are who you are, if the system does not actually acknowledge that, then nothing happens for you. And in this particular case, there were cases where death was the result. Surely, again, that's not a data protection violation. With Arogya Setu, I think also to give an example in the context of the pandemic specifically, we see this where whether or not you have that app on your phone now determines whether or not you've provided that data to the system, determines whether you can fly, whether you can take the metro in Delhi. It seems as if you can take a train, and in many cases now also if you can get to work. We've even tracked incidents where medical care was made conditional on that. Again, just being there with your physical body is not enough anymore. So what has happened really is that the data about our bodies has become the ultimate point of control, almost like a digital leash of what our bodies are able to do, the rights they have access to, the autonomy and dignity they have access to. And so our argument is that we really have to put this back into the debate. There might be instances in which we still want to relax some of the human rights standards, but really seeing that connection with our bodies makes it obvious how the potential harms of data misuse go much, much beyond concerns of data protection or privacy. And that for that reason, this is also what needs to be the starting point for any policy that we design. Thank you.
Thank you, Anja. That was quite powerful, and I'm sure there are people who might want to ask you questions. May I please request that we hold off on asking questions till the other two speakers have spoken. Our next speaker is Louise Byrne. Louise joined APPI Foundation in 2019 as Program Manager for Africa and Asia, and was promoted to Program Director for Europe and Asia in early 2020. Before APPI, Louise spent 8 years working for Comic Relief, a major UK grant maker, managing development projects across Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Her areas of expertise include participatory approaches to grant making, women and girls' rights, and youth leadership. Louise will speak to us today about the demand for data, what do funders want, and what do funders need, And she'll also give us some guiding principles that funders can hopefully adopt. Over to you, Louise.
Thank you, Raghu. So just to start, just for those who haven't heard of the EPPI Foundation, just to say EPPI is a grant-making foundation. We fund organisations that fight to change the lives of disadvantaged children and youth globally. As Raghu mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the demand for data from a kind of donor's perspective. I want to start by talking about the elephant in the room, and I think Anja touched on this briefly, which is the power imbalance between funders and NGOs. Obviously, funders have the power to grant funds and to withhold funds. This ultimately means they can influence NGO behaviour. We all know this, but we rarely kind of discuss it. I think it's really important to frame the conversation in this way, because often NGOs can feel quite beholden to the demands of a donor. This exertion of power, it can result in a kind of real lack of dialogue, and in some circumstances, NGOs are kind of forced to compromise their ethics or accept partnerships on kind of unfavourable terms. So this is where I think is really vital for funders to be responsible in their demands. I think when we demand data, we should be thinking, firstly, what's reasonable to demand, and secondly, what's necessary. And also enable our partners the opportunity to push back and to tell us why perhaps some of our demands are not reasonable, even if we think they are. So why do we need data? Firstly, obviously, accountability. Just as social organisations have to be accountable to funders, funders also have to be accountable to our funders and our boards. We must check that funds are used for the purposes intended. But just as organisations have this upward accountability to their donors and other stakeholders, I think it's really important for us to recognise that they also have what's been termed downward accountability to the communities they serve. I think this is something responsible funders must keep in mind, and we must accept that we're not the only stakeholder in the equation, and that I think data is a good example of where our needs can conflict, and this can leave kind of NGOs in this unenviable position of kind of arbitrating between donor demands and the rights of the individuals they serve. The second reason, obviously, we need data is evidence. As a sector, we're constantly trying to drive towards evidence-based interventions. We want to fund what works, what has an impact. In the drive towards this, there's this ever-increasing pressure on organisations to show results and to show impact, and this drives our desire for ever-increasing amounts of data. I think increasingly sometimes in scenarios where data is perhaps not the answer or not the only answer. So what do we need? I think firstly to say what we need is subjective. There's no kind of universal benchmark. What a bilateral funder might need will differ significantly from that of a charitable foundation. I think ultimately we need to ensure money is spent well. However, we need to balance this drive towards data and transparency and accountability with the rights of the individuals we serve. Everyone should have the right to remain anonymous when they're accessing life-saving services, and everyone should have the right to have their data treated in responsible and appropriate ways. There's also other tools we can use as funder to ensure things like compliance. We can conduct financial audits, we can conduct site visits, we can interview staff, we can commission independent evaluations. But I think this is also, it's really important to talk about trust here. Trust as a really key component in the relationship between a funder and an NGO. In everyday life, we wouldn't buy goods or services from a company we didn't trust. So why would we fund an organisation we don't trust? So whilst funders can and do audits and site visits and all the rest of it, it's not feasible to audit every expense or verify every service user, and nor should we. We should be working with organisations we trust. Without trust on both sides, these partnerships can collapse. So just to finish with some kind of key principles, these are kind of some rough thoughts I had. I'd be really interested to hear from the audience today about amendments or additions to this list, because I think it's, it could be a really useful kind of tool for funders to either sign up to or kind of work work within. So firstly, funders, I believe, should be opening up spaces for NGOs to push back and to have authentic conversations where they can voice concerns over requests that they feel breach their ethics or individuals' rights. Secondly, we need to interrogate our decisions to collect data. I think it's, as Anja touched on, it's all too often the first kind of go-to, but actually, do we ever stop and think, do we really need this data? And is there another way of evidencing impact here or compliance here?
Louise, we seem to have lost you.
Louise,
sorry.
yeah, we seem to have
Louise,
lost
we
you.
lost you after your second principle.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Okay, so the third point was around ensuring our partners have responsible data collection policies and ensuring these policies are put into practice, and equally ensuring funders have responsible data collection policies as well. And just finally, I think whilst we must continue to drive towards evidence-based interventions, we have to do this in a way that doesn't compromise our principles and ethics. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. With that, we come to the last speaker of the day, and we'll come back to the questions that people might have for Louise at the end of Jacob's talk. Jacob John leads the FX and learning team at the Azim Premji Philanthropic Initiatives. The team looks at the effect of the grants made by the philanthropy, as well as how it can inform the grant making process. Before this transition, Jacob had led the criminal justice and water teams at the philanthropy. Jacob's earlier experiences included working with farmers to set up sustainable agricultural value chains and working with producer groups across India to enable greater incomes for farmers. Today, Jacob will look at issues around data and privacy, both as a practitioner on the ground as well as a grant maker. His talk will also highlight the importance of dialogue in order to ensure that data needs are met, but without compromising on an individual's privacy. Over to you, Jacob.
So thank you, Rob. So I think that I'd like to thank both Anja and Louise for setting it up. And I agree with mostly everything that they say. So there's actually very little that I'm going to add in terms of substantive content, right? But basically, I mean, the subtopics today seem to suggest that we have one big donor who's actually out there, who's there to aggregate a lot of the information that's collected. And then the question is, what happens to that data? And it kind of is a big black hole. So for me, I think the subheadings of, what do donors need? How can they use it? How will all of that? I think they're a bit of a red herring. Because, I mean, I'll just give you two stories. And one, I was in a village in Rajasthan some time ago, and there was an organization that was proudly showing me, the accounts of a federation, SAG federation. And it had all kinds of data. It had persons' names, family details, land ownership, mobile surprise, and no surprise, the big Aadhaar number as well. Right? And then I just generally asked, so why do you keep all this information? Do you have a data protection policy? Do you have any of that? And the best part of it is that everybody in that office knew the password to access that database as well. So in a sense, it's not, I mean, what I want to highlight is that this is a practice that's actually happened in the field that I saw in Rajasthan. So that's kind of one. I'll also give you another example of a donor who basically specifically told its partners, do not send any individual information to us that that you are giving legal aid to. I mean, so that they specifically called out and said, do not send any of that information to us. And the donor informally, I mean, that was the formal letter said that. Then informally, it basically was like, listen, I don't want at any stage, if the government asks me, do you have data about this person and their case, I want to be truthfully able to say, I have no information at all. So, I mean, it was a strategic choice in a sense of the donor to say, listen, I don't want to be in a place where I have to lie to government, right? So so for me, like these two examples also bring out a few points, right? So a few principles. And data and privacy, in a sense, still largely exist in a sense in the elitist imagination of our worlds. And even in an NGO, which is a very large NGO, it was not captured in day-to-day operations of how they actually dealt with data, right? And this is not, and it's a large NGO is all I'm going to say. And different donors also see the risks of having data with them. So the donor world is also not homogeneous. I mean, the CSO world is not homogeneous, and neither is the NGO world. The donor world is a huge range, and you have, for the lack of a better word, you have bean counters on one end, and you have trust-based philanthropy all on the other, and you have everything in between, where trust-based philanthropy, where people say, we trust you, and we do not seek to get data at such a great level of granularity that we can't even do anything with it. And so what I'd like to actually talk about is it's actually not so much a donor or a civil society problem as much as, like in India's case, it's also, it is a data problem because we're also in the early stages of our journey on what data can do, in terms of large numbers of people being aware about it. And I'd also like to flag off and say, see, when the risk of misuse, that was flagged off multiple times by Anja through Arogya Setu and, the other possible, Aadhaar and all those possibilities is basic. Like, so in those kind of cases, the principle, who is an NGO likely to be able to misuse the data as much as, let's say, an SSG federation versus a donor versus a state government versus a central government versus, let's say, the police department of a particular state. So there are whose hands is the data going into is kind of a big question that we actually need to look at. And therefore, the data protection policies that Louise also touched upon. Yeah. So the one or two things I'd like to actually say before I finish is that I actually cringe that when we kind of sometimes paint this caricature of NGOs as these large bunch of disempowered people, right? And who have no autonomy or power to actually have a conversation. Because on the other side, and I think that we should create the space for the dialogue. And I think on the other side, there are equally large numbers of people. On the other side, meaning on the donor side, there are individuals who are very cognizant of data and very cognizant that it's something that we need to actually talk about and we need to respect and we need to have policies on and all of that. So every time there is a demand for data, I feel that there is also an opportunity for a pushback. And there are times when I've done, because I've worked for so many years in the field, I've also done a lot of grandstanding. And I've said, listen, if you want the data, I'm not going to give it. You can take your money and go away. Knowing full well we had no funding the next year if they basically said, okay, we're going to walk out. But it's always a bit, so of course I've done a bit of grandstanding, but at the same time, donors have come back and said, yes, okay, let's talk. So what is an acceptable via media? How can we deal with the question of accountability? What is the accountability? What is the accountability that our board expects, the donors board expects? And how can we actually use different ways of getting you the data, which is not intrusive? Yeah, so that's kind of, and the last bit, I think that what Louise said is very important. How do we build a culture of trust, and which goes both ways? How do we build a culture of trust between both civil society as well as donors is a very, very important question. And how do we get civil society and donors to be co-travelers on this journey and not persons who are kind of, okay, I give you the money, therefore I have the power. But I've also heard the other side of the story, which is as soon as I get the money, I don't say any. As soon as I get the money, I'm not going to listen to you. So there, I mean, given that, I mean, how do we move away from the gamification of this relationship is the question that we should look at. And how do we build evidence together? I mean, because evidence is something that all of us agree is important. And what are the ways in which we can build evidence while respecting data and privacy? Yeah, I will end there. Yeah, thanks so much, Raghuvan. Thanks, Arun.
Thank you, Jacob. That was quite awesome. We can now open the floor up for questions and discussions. There have been a few notes and few comments which have come in on the chat window, and I'm going to start by reading some of them. After that, you are free to either put in more of your thoughts on the chat window and we can go through as many as we can, or just feel free to ask some questions. But I'll just start with a few comments which have come in. This is from Arun Kumar to Anja. Data, as you so beautifully put it, is intrinsically a process of detaching body from its voice. It sounds so true and frightening. What is the way out? Could we in any way minimize the violence in knowing, in collecting information in order to know? It looks like an epistemological moribund. Anja, if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I think the challenge really lies in the way we look at data at the moment, right? First of all, the fact that actually often much more data is taken beyond what is needed to solve the problem at hand. And the way that, in a sense, takes away the control that people have over where their data goes. So one more thing that when we talk about privacy at the Internet Democracy Project, we actually talk about it in terms of boundary management. And with that I mean, so mostly debates about privacy are in the context of, say, the home, and then there is a space, and privacy as a concept is attached to that space. When you think about privacy as boundary management, it's really about what are you sharing with who, for what reason, at what moment in time. And that's a very dynamic concept that actually constantly changes depending on your context. But it's also really important to live a life of dignity, to be able to develop yourself as a human being beyond the controls of the society you live in, which to some extent you will value, to some extent you will react against. So how do you get the spaces to actually develop a different way of being? Boundary management is a really crucial mechanism in this. And I think, so for us, the starting point in how do we stop that violence is really this question: how do you give people back more control over that boundary management? And this in a way relates, I know there is a question about consent on the chat as well, which was also addressed to me. And since they fit together so well, Raghu, is it okay if I answer that immediately as well?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, that was going to be the next question. So please feel free to respond to that as well.
Because so I think this whole question of how do you minimize the violence, first of all, if gathering data from a community is something that happens together with the people in that community, where decisions about what data is taken and to who it is going are made in a more collective way with much greater input, I think that would be a really good starting point. That is not going to be a matter of law, it's going to be a matter of ethics. But surely for the people who will be affected by this, to have input in it is a really good starting point. And actually, one thing I kept reminding of, even when we were just discussing the idea of this webinar, is a column that Natasha Batwa recently wrote for LifeMint. Wait, I have the title. What will I do when this food runs out? And she was handing out food to a woman who got really angry with her. And that's, I think, like the dignity of that woman to say, now what do you expect? Gratitude. And in a way, all this collecting of details is also that, right? Like how many people who receive relief at the moment have to express gratitude to? for being in a situation that is not their own of the making in the first place. So I think that having more collaborative approaches is really important. The second thing is actually what Louise and Jacob said also, no? How do we build systems of trust? And I think also within the law, we have to think about that much, much more. What would it mean to have an ecosystem around data, even at the national level with the government, with all private companies where you as a user get ways to develop trust? And then thirdly, coming to the consent question, within the Internet Democracy Project, we're actually almost done with a paper that looks specifically at how we can reimagine consent in data governance, taking data as body as the starting point. And what we did was, the paper focuses on us going back to debates around sexual relationships and how consent and sexual relationships has been conceptualized within feminism. But we also went back to look at work around consent in research, and again focusing mostly on feminist research. But both of these have been places where these kind of debates have actually been very similar, very alive. And what we see, what are some of the very different ways in which consent is operationalized there, is that first of all, the idea that you can give consent to give your data and then not have the faintest idea how it is going to be used is basically not having the faintest idea, at least, is not acceptable. While effectively, in many cases, that is what we do right now. No? Even with some of the donors who are asking your data, I'm not sure if civil society organizations always know what they are doing with it. If a private player is asking for an Aadhaar number and that benefits them in other ways as well, how does that sit together in their databases? What are they building on top of that, right? So I think that is one starting point. The second that we see in these debates very strongly, so you just give to start with, you only give the data that's needed and you know what it's going to be used for. Secondly, there is negotiation. At the moment, consent in data governance is really a joke because you can never take it back, or you can never say stop. You can go this far, but not any further. While in all other circumstances, to have informed consent that is meaningful in any way, actually having a process of negotiation, of reassessment is kind of core to this. And the third thing I wanted to highlight is that this might all sound that people will say, oh, but how is that even feasible with the way like data economies work at the moment, etc. But I think it opens up new possibilities. It doesn't open up the possibility of a company, even say Google, Facebook, or a donor or whoever, taking our data at the starting point and saying, we're going to do with it whatever we want and build new products on top of it or new insights which might harm your community even, but you wouldn't know because you never gave consent. What it would do is actually develop a relationship where over time, you would be able to give that consent. And I find it really interesting, for example, data protection legislations around the world right now have as one of their core principles actually purpose limitation, even though it's formulated in so vague a manner that it doesn't mean very much. But what I find interesting is that with the few companies whose products I use, and I do happen to pay for those also, but they have free versions available as well. But the few ones that I do use, I wouldn't mind beyond the point if they would ask me and say, hey, we would like to get access to this data as well because we want to build XYZ product and we think you might like it. In those cases, I wouldn't mind saying, okay, I think I like what you've done so far. I like the way you've been dealing with this. And so let me give you more data based on that, where you actually give them consent to play with what you have provided, right? But also getting something back for that in return. So I think if we start to really dig into what could alternative principles be, and put what Louise also flagged, that question of the power relationships in any context between who takes the data and who gives the data back on the table again, and start building the policies, whether in organizations or at a national level, that really address that, we could actually start to have a very different data ecosystem that would work much better for people.
Thank you, Anja. There are a couple of more questions which have come in for you, but you did mention that you're not keeping in the best of health. Would you just like to take a break while we go around to the other speakers with a couple of questions? Is that okay with you?
That would be great. Let's come back to them later. Thanks.
Great. The next two questions, actually, I think maybe Jacob would probably be able to respond to this. I'm just clubbing two questions here and addressing them to Jacob. One is from Ninad. In regards to data specifically, when personally identifiable information is asked by auditors to check back on whether the beneficiary was supported or not, how does one rationalize these questions? My question is to donors or to auditors, how do we tackle this situation? That's the first question. The second question is from Preeti Patkar. We have had a donor who wanted us to share prior data on all the families who would be provided relief, their contact numbers and Aadhaar details, etc., and in quotes, to ensure transparency and accountability. Jacob, would you mind answering those questions?
So the answer is I have no magic formula. So I think that this is definitely a question that you need to ask of, okay, under what law do you require uniquely verifiable information? And have a conversation around that. I mean, do you require it under the Income Tax Act? Do you require it under, the Societies Act? And have a longer conversation. And the answer is clearly that they will come up short with answers because of which case law, where, how. Ultimately, aggregate utilization is what is really required at most, at best. I do not think that there is a law. If there are lawyers in this forum, please jump in and say so. But I do not think there is a law in this country which actually tells a donor to collect individual information for a donor to collect that kind of information. Speak up and have a conversation. If donors still say that, listen, we still require it, then there are two ways. Decide what your ethical stand is and say that, and if you have to, like I did, I do a bit of grandstanding and say we won't do it. Or say, fine, in this case, I'll do it, but I'm not going to have a relationship with you anymore. Or basically, yeah, there's no magic. There's no magic formula on this.
Does anyone in the audience want to respond to that? Or can we move on?
Yeah, so Swapna has a response.
I can also see Naghma Mula has put her hand up. One of you want to go?
Whatever you say. My name is Swapna. I'm a lawyer. And I would just like to respond to what Mr. Jacob John was saying. I think that it need not be such a confusing issue. Principles of informed consent and collecting data have been established quite solidly in other areas, probably not in donor areas of donorship and sponsorship that you're talking about. But I work, for instance, in clinical trial ethics, and I chair a committee on clinical trial ethics in Chennai. So here, if you see, the principles are about the same. The first point is, what are you conveying to the person whose data you're collecting? Have you provided full information about what data you're collecting and why you are collecting and for what purpose it will be collected, how long it will be kept with you, and to whom it will be transferred? One as raw data, the other as aggregate data, or as we call it, anonymized data. So once the donor of the data is aware of what is going to be done with the data, then it's up to them to consent to transferring the data to a third person. As far as the second part is concerned, whether the donor can demand the data, personal data, in particular personal data that can be used to identify the recipient, it completely depends on the contract that you have signed with them. If you have agreed to it, then it is your duty to inform the recipient that data will be handed over to the donor. I think in this case, it is the right of the person who gives their data to decide whether the data should go or not. It is also, as Mr. Jacob John pointed out, it is more the aggregate and anonymized data that matters rather than individuals, unless you're tracking them over a longer period of time or you're creating a cohort of people to do some randomized studies or randomized control studies or something like that, in which case it may be required. In other cases, I don't think it will be required. This is my input.
Swapna, when you add the two principles of your first thing of informed consent and then basically what is required in terms of the contract that's been signed to the donor, it becomes a very high burden on the part of a person collecting to actually have informed consent at a time of a pandemic.
Yes.
Yeah. So in reality, therefore, I highly doubt it's going to be possible for anyone to say that, hey, it's informed consent and so on.
You are probably right, because at this point we are working on clinical trials with regard to this particular pandemic, and the issues that you are saying are quite, we're facing them in reality, because while we are supposed to guarantee confidentiality, we also know that the investigator has to give the details to the government and to certain other agencies. So here the information, the informed consent must include the information that such data will reach certain persons. Either it may be a governmental authority or a donor. So it's more about accepting that the recipient has the right over their data and what is done with it, and giving them a choice over whether they would like the data to be handed over to the donor or not.
Yeah, hi, this is Naghma here. No, I have just, some very few points which I will make quickly. Very, very good insights from Anja, Jacob, as well as Louise. But I want to also focus a little bit on what I think is the negotiating capacity of an average organization that is receiving funds from funders. I'm a funder myself, and I coordinate a lot of funding for the smaller NGOs. And most of the time they feel that they are helpless to negotiate, and therefore they must agree and comply to whatever is the requirement. I don't think there's even much of a serious thought that goes into whether this data requirement is there or not. And these are the facts of the case, simply because it is a fund crunched sector, and people truly believe that they are not in a position of ignoring what is demanded by the funders. I have many a times felt that it all boils down. Also, one of the important factors is the negotiating capacity of the sector as a whole. Because we are not synchronized on our unified response, or we have not taken a position as a sector that operates in human development or in relief provision. We are also open to interpretations of those who provide resources to us. And this I feel time and again, when people who believe in a certain philosophy have to completely succumb at times when funding is critical and they really want their work not to suffer. So to almost everyone here on this webinar, my submission is that this pandemic also gives us an opportunity to really relook as how we operate as a sector and as individual participants in a multifaceted, multi-operational setup, where certain sets of good behavior and certain rules of discourse or operations have to be set. Simply put, in the financial world, it's a very clear understanding what even something as simple as a net profit is. If there was no definition to a net profit, and if there was no rules around how it would be measured, we would have different kinds of numbers coming from everywhere. But simply because there's a simple definition put and a rule around how it's calculated is put, everyone from Amsterdam to India to Australia will look at net profit and only understand the same thing. Similarly, the do's and don'ts of this sector need to be looked at very critically. And for certain basic things like privacy and security, we should be collectively having a view of what we should and what we should not do, is my humble submission. Thank you.
Thank you, Naghma. Do any of the panelists want to respond to her points?
Sure, I just my internet connection's a bit unstable, so just let me know if you can't hear me. But I think that's a really interesting point on you know, there's no kind of unified sector response to donor demands, and I think what we often see is because there ends up being a competition for funds. So organizations struggle to speak to each other about funders or about funding opportunities, and they struggle to form alliances occasionally because of this kind of competition. And I think that's something funders need to really work to overcome, because it's not good for the sector as a whole. And it, you know, there is power in collectivism, and I think the more the sector can kind of formulate a set of kind of principles or demands, the better it will be to kind of voice them. And I completely get the point about people not having negotiating power. And again, I think that's on the responsibility of the funder to open that up as much as they possibly can. I don't think there's a silver bullet. I think with money comes power. But I think the more we can push to allow those kind of really open conversations, the more it can kind of help that transparency.
So Ingrid actually posted an interesting response, and I think I should just bring it up, saying that educate, organize, and agitate. And it's also up to the large players on both sides, the donor side as well as the civil society side, to actually bring that change. So yeah, I think that definitely would be a good step if we, on both sides, the larger players, and this is a good, I mean, and therefore it's good that Apnalaya, for example, has brought out this issue for a conversation. Yeah.
On that comment, though, my first thought, I have to admit, was maybe it should actually be the small players, because if the small players start, the chances that it will get pushed much further are much bigger. If the big players start, I think we will get a more mainstream response. I also briefly wanted to comment on Swapna's suggestion. I do agree with you that there is a lot of value at looking at debates around consent in the context of criminal trials as well. It's also something we've looked at, because when we think of data as an extension of the body, we also started to look at, so how has this been dealt when you actually talk about people's bodies elsewhere? But where I think there is a difference is beyond what Jacob said about, like, in the context of relief, how can there be informed consent? The thing is that even if it's genuinely informed, people can't really say no, right? And I think that's not only true, like if you're going to have to choose between dying from hunger or giving your data to whoever, then you will take the food, right? And in those, for me, actually, that is a red flag that you shouldn't be taking any data at all, because in that case, informed consent is impossible. And I find it a violation to human dignity then to still go ahead knowing that this cannot happen in a correct way.
Thank you, Anja. There are a couple of more hands coming up, but Swapna, you had earlier put a question in the chat window to Anja about Arogya Setu. Do you just want to ask her that?
Yeah, I think the question is already there. Basically, I'm again coming back to the necessity of having guidelines and laws. I have also put up and extracted and put up section 12 of the Personal Data Protection Bill of 2018. Had it come through, then it says that personal data may be processed on the basis of consent as per the Contract Act of 1872. So basically, there are also guidelines for collecting data on health and so on. So my question was whether Arogya Setu, whatever health data they are collecting, have you been able to identify whether the guidelines of 2016 for EHR, e-health records, apply to Arogya Setu?
I saw your question earlier, Swapna, and I don't know. So I think my friends will ask them. They haven't gotten back to me yet, but we'll look and we can share it with Raghu and his colleagues, so the answer will still get to you. But I look into it. It's a really good question, actually.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Arun Nathan, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? You've had your hand up for a while now. Arun, are you there?
Hello.
Yeah, Arun, we can hear you. Can you please go ahead and ask your question?
Yes. So I have a specific question. I work with an early stage grant making organization. We support NGO partners in distributing dry ration kits. And what we also do is we request the NGOs to share with us distribution list as to the families to whom they have given. From a data privacy and use point of view, we share that we are ready to sign a non-disclosure agreement with the NGO as far as the data is concerned. Now, my question is, would you suggest that this approach is okay? Because from a data point of view, we want to be fair in terms of our expectations towards the NGOs.
Would Jacob want to respond to that? Arun, is there anyone specifically you would like for you to respond to your question?
No, this is a general question to you.
Okay, sure.
So you collect individual data, but you don't give it to anyone. That's the that's what you've said, right? I mean, is that correct, Arun?
Hello. Yes, yes. So
yeah.
The NGO collects the data about the family. We request that the NGO share the details with us. We don't say give us extra data, but whatever data you collect, share with us. We will not share it with anyone else.
Sure. The first question you should ask is should the NGO collect that data? And also, for example, the question that I think Anja just raised, the ethics of collecting data at the point of a pandemic. So is that data conditional on giving food? And if it is in the context of a pandemic, what are the ethical issues around that? Is it fair to actually ask a person who's likely to be hungry if they don't get that food to share their data, or else there's no food? So I think that it's not a easy answer. So that's kind of one thing. The second is, what do you do with the data? I mean, why if you kind of are keeping that data, the question of, why does it matter to you if that data is with you, or is it if it's with the NGO? If, like, let's say now the NGO collects the data, now why do you need it as a funder? If it is accessible at a given point of time for you to make phone calls to check, isn't that sufficient as a standard? If you want to actually send volunteers on the field with the NGO partners to see if the food has reached the intended people and do a random survey, shouldn't that be sufficient? So we should, the way you phrased your question, it makes data and the collection of data almost benign. But I think that what will help is if you ask the question of why you would like that data, then it kind of brings up a lot of interesting dimensions to it. Yeah.
Arun Nathan, would you like to respond?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. So I think that, yes, so as long as the data is available with the NGO and it is accessible, that kind of is a great thing to do. The question that I have is, even if the NGO has the data, is it fair from a grant-making organization point of view for us to request for that particular data? So I am just trying to see that we want to ensure fairness from our side and not make unfair demands.
So I don't understand your fairness question, in the sense that why do you want the data is what you have to primarily answer. And when you answer that question, then the question on fairness will actually come out. I mean, why do you think it's fair or unfair to have the data or not have the data? And Arun, we could have a longer conversation offline if this is not clear. I mean, I'm happy to speak to you.
Yeah, maybe we could take that offline. Ankur
Yeah.
Singh has put his hand up. Ankur, is your question about any of the things that we've been talking about right now? If so, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Jacob. Thanks, Louise. Thanks, Anja, for such beautiful insights. And I'm really gaining from your point of views. I have one question. I understand that achieving the optimal balance where rights and benefits are in accord is challenging and unlikely to be constant over time, because it depends on factors like state of art, research, infrastructure, and societal perceptions. So basically, the processing of data, as far as I understand, should happen in a way that data can no longer be attributed to a specific data subject without the use of additional information, as long as such additional information is kept separately and subject to technical and organizational measures to ensure non-attribution to an identifiable or identified person. So basically, we can have those organizational measures in place before that we are approaching any donor or we are going to any other organization out there. First of all, we should have our own organizational measures that we should have in place. Yes, of course, technical measures are very sophisticated these days. To implement those technical measures, you need a lot of advanced skills by which you can prevent the breach of data or misuse of data by anybody out there. So how do you do the right combination of that technical and organizational measures where your data is not misused or by anybody out there, when you have so many other priorities like you have to implement the program out there on the ground, you have to be accountable to your own work on the ground. So in such a scenario, how you're gonna be implement those advanced technical measures and organizational guidelines in place where that your data would stay protected and would be used for the right purpose.
Thanks, Ankur. Is there anyone on the panel who would like to respond to her?
I'll take one piece and respond because there are many issues that have been brought up. So one piece, for example, is I don't think that just anonymized data, for example, is a problem. Like, so for example, if you take and this is a purely hypothetical and fictional example, right? Now, if you collect religion data or caste data or whatever, and then you identify that a particular basti or a particular street in a pandemic situation, everybody is of a particular community, right? Now, potentially, someone who has access to not individual data, but actually knowledge that this basti is of a particular community could actually say, okay, don't give anything on this street or don't supply any relief on this street. Is that ethical is the question that then I would ask. So this is not, we are not going to the level of the individual here. We are basically going at the level of of a community in a particular street. So that's so it's, I think that the traceability is important, and basically it's not just about whether an individual can be identified or not, and how that data could potentially be used or misused.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone's put in a comment, Phil has put in a comment which I think is relevant at this stage. He's saying, this is just a comment, not a question. Aggregate data isn't the same as anonymized data. Sometimes outlier records can unintentionally disclose a person's identity even when presented in aggregate. Alternate techniques are required to properly safeguard identity, which I think is very close to the point that you made, Jacob. There's a comment from Manisha Gupta. There are several lists that are being compiled which aggregate names of NGOs doing large or small scale relief. These have the potential of finding their way to Niti Aayog and other government platforms, almost as data feeders. Then again, district governments are asking local NGOs to partner with them in COVID relief efforts. This eventually gives the government the leverage to ask NGOs for data of recipients. So how can civil society be more careful about data privacy issues as they go about their well-intentioned relief efforts? Again, either Jacob or Anja, would one of you like to respond?
No, I mean, if there are others who can respond also, I think that, for example, Naghma is also there, so she could possibly respond. I know that
Absolutely. If there's anyone in the audience who also wants to respond, please do that. Please go ahead.
Yeah.
My somewhat unhelpful response would be, especially with the government, if you're worried they're going to ask for the data, don't collect it. Because right now, legally, there are so many laws that make it possible for the government to ask for data in those cases that I don't really see how legally you could refuse it. So I also wanted to briefly comment on Ankur's and indirectly on Arun's interventions. I realized that as an organization, the collection of data might also be really helpful to improve your own programs, and that's part of the reason why you actually collect it, right? But I do think it's important to be aware that actually anonymizing your data is virtually impossible. It's not just about outlier cases, actually. There have been studies with samples as small as 374 on a US university campus to 10 lakh people in Belgium. And in each case, around 4 socioeconomic data points was enough to re-identify 75 to 80% in the people of those samples. And depending on the data that you're collecting, these numbers are even higher. So whatever data you're collecting, I think it's important to remember that anonymization rarely is a solution because it can almost always be re-identified, at least for a very large part of that sample. And maybe to Arun's earlier comment, building on what Jacob said, so the question really is, do you need to have the same data as the organizations you fund? Because again, they might be collecting data which is quite intimate, but because the grantee, the people they work with trust them, and which will help them to improve their program, supposing they have built very strong protection protocols around it. But why should they then automatically give all of that to you? As a funder, you do not need to know, you don't need to answer exactly the same questions as the organization does, right? I think that's kind of making more blunt what Jacob was saying. Sorry if I misrepresented your comments, Jacob.
Thanks for that, Anja. We are running short of time. I'm just going to wrap up maybe with a couple of questions, and then we can have closing remarks from the speakers. The next 2 questions, I think, are for, just a second. To Louise and Jacob, how does one build a system of trust from the position of powerlessness, by Arun Kumar? There's also another question, more specifically to Louise, I think, which is around GDPR kind of regulations. Swapna has asked this question again, is the donor in the US or Europe not bound by data protection regulations in their specific countries? So Louise, if you want to go first.
Sure, thank you. So just to respond to the question around trust, I think it's a really valid question. I think ultimately building trust takes time. And I think to achieve it, you have to practice what you preach as well. So for example, one of the things we do at the APPI Foundation is we provide unrestricted funding to the organizations we support. This is, I mean, there's many benefits actually to unrestricted funding, and I can talk about it for a very long time. I won't bore you with it, but I think one of the things that does is it says to the organizations we support, we know you are the experts on the ground. We know you understand your organization the best, and you know how best to spend that money to have the greatest impact. And I think that's a really useful tool to build that trust. We're not asking to check every penny is spent on the biros that they originally budgeted for. We effectively hand over some power, and I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. On the GDPR question, that's absolutely right. Actually, in terms of UK and US organisations, we do have to comply with data protection laws in our countries. I think there's bigger questions around how that works globally, and then those gaps when we have like the European Union who have established the GDPR laws in place, but then how does that work when countries work together, and countries that are missing that kind of that regulation in place? And I think also, I'm certainly no data expert, but I would suggest perhaps people who know more about it than me would suggest there's many gaps and many loopholes in that legislation that allow people to still kind of effectively breach the legislation.
Yeah.
I'll possibly just add one more thing. I think that if we can build a conversation, and this is the responsibility of everyone in the sector, including the donors as well as civil society, that we need to actually build an understanding that social change is very complex, and also possibly try to get people to internalize the idea that I can contribute to change, but move away from the idea to that, when I make this when I make this donation, this change is attributable to my donation or my contribution in that sense. So, and that's a hard, it's a very difficult shift, but it's an important shift. And when we actually, therefore, when that happens, I think that's from the side of the donors. The second, from the side of, civil society is also build some sort of framework around, how does change happen, and how do we contribute? What are the multiple ways in which we can contribute to it? And then build that conversation between donors as well as civil society.
Thank you, Jacob. Just one comment which has come in around what Louise was mentioning. This is coming in from Annabelle about trust, and maybe we can close the questions with this, because I do want to see if there's a little bit of a window available for the speakers to ask questions to each other if they choose to, for the panelists to ask questions of each other if they choose to. But before that, a comment from Annabelle. Louise, happy to hear you stress about the importance of trust, something I have said repeatedly, but I was very distressed to hear that you use the word downward accountability. So we, the NGOs, are below you, the donors or the funders. And for over 40 years, I have argued for triangular contracts between three equal partners: the donor, the implementation NGO, and the beneficiaries. So Louise, if you want to respond to that.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And sorry, I tried to actually stress a little bit in my talk that it has been termed downward accountability, and I totally appreciate the connotations that has in terms of power structures. So this came from a research paper where they described upward accountability, downward accountability, internal and external. I think ultimately it's a reflection of the power imbalance that we talked about before. I think the point of triangular contracts is really interesting. Actually, I've been reading a bit about this just this morning, about the potential for organizations to do kind of dual due diligence. So NGOs actually do due diligence on the funder at the same time. obviously this doesn't kind of totally solve the issues in terms of power imbalance, but it does give NGOs information, and information is some level of power. It does give them more to push back on if they know all of the funders' policies, and then the funder is demanding more of them. It gives them a little bit more room to maneuver, I would suggest. I read an interesting piece from, I can't remember who wrote it now, but we can send around the link, but talking about, rather than these kind of grant making contracts that we currently use, how about rather than using terms like the partner and the delivery agent, we use all parties. So the majority of the contract applies to everyone in that contract, rather than it being one way. I think these are all kind of really interesting ideas on how we can start to think about shifting the power, but absolutely acknowledge your comment on downward accountability and how laden that term is.
Thanks, Louise. We are 20 minutes past 6 o'clock here in India. Just final thoughts or comments from any of the speakers, if you do have, and then we can move to the last stage of the webinar. So just over to you, the panelists, if any of you want to make final closing remarks.
Raghu, I think there was actually one question addressed to me which we didn't take, which was about whether war narratives relating to the pandemic would increase data valence.
Yes, go for it, Anja. We can close with that question maybe.
I wanted to answer it because I'm not sure if it will go as far as governments actually using that language to mandate even bigger surveillance, but it has actually been a concern for us at the Internet Democracy Project. The way that the narrative of war is used in general already, and also I think criminalization. And I think these two are very closely concerned. So one can think of, if taking data is always a way of surveillance, at the moment, what we see is that actually it does very often lead to criminalization. It puts specific people in a spot. It highlights parts of your identity which you might not necessarily want to release. This is why it's so particularly difficult for people who are already part of a vulnerable community. But among feminists, for example, there has also been work on surveillance as care. And you see this, for example, when a young middle-class family has a baby and they use one of these baby monitors to make sure they can hear the baby in the next door room cry. Strictly speaking, that's data valence, but nobody is going to think of that as a bad thing, right? And it has to do with both what you are actually aiming for, also the power relationships among the people, what the outcomes are, etc. So we can actually, even around surveillance, definitely in the context of a pandemic, we could have a very different narrative. It's clear in India that we are going the criminalization way. We see growing stigma of specific communities, and what we already see is that the language of national security is actually used in a growing number of cases. So if you look at the CPRF has come out with guidelines for the security of the metro in Delhi and airports around the country, and the first paragraph in that is about national security data in the pandemic. And they use the phrase national security, right? So I think it's right that you flagged it, and something to really keep an eye out for. We can, there is a different narrative that is possible around data. And that's maybe one more thing that civil society could consider. How can we shift that? Because with that shifting narrative also comes a different approach to how you collect and use data.
Thank you, Anja. That's a great way to end this. And I'm afraid we are running out of time, so I think we will just have to move to the next stage of the webinar. Soumya has actually put out a note on the chat window. If anyone has any more questions, any more points you want to bring up, please do send us an email, and we can take this with the speakers, panelists offline. We will have to soon close this webinar. I think it's been a terrific discussion. We've spoken about a lot of wide range of things in the entire gamut of data, ethics, and privacy, right from national security to Arogya Setu to what more should donors do and what more can implementation organizations do and triangular contracts. It's been a really wide range of discussions, very vibrant. Thank you to everyone who participated and to the panelists, of course. With this, I'd like to invite Arun Kumar and Tom Thomas, the CEOs of Apnalaya and Praxis, respectively, to take us through for the next couple of minutes about what the next steps after this webinar look like. Arun, if you could start. Arun, are you there?
Yeah, I am. I think I was struggling to unmute myself. Okay. Initially, I thought that I couldn't unmute myself. Okay, so it was absolutely fascinating. I think I wish we had much longer time. I think maybe we need to meet again. I think what came across very clearly is that there are four key players in this debate: civil society organizations, the people or community on whose behalf we collect the data, the donors, and the government. Going ahead, I think we'll need to look at each of these and discuss in detail what requires to be done in order to not cause any injuries to anybody's dignity. And we know more often than not who comes across or who ends up in much more injured situation when it comes to a question of keeping one's dignity intact. There is a fair degree of onus on us, members of civil society, I think, and it needs to be explored, for the lack of a better term, who will bell the cat, who will take the discussion out. Big NGOs, small NGOs, NGOs and funders together, perhaps, as some of the suggestions were particularly coming from Ingrid. I think the first step could be strengthening civil society's response to this issue. People must come in. How does a medium like this, a Zoom discussion, can involve people's voice or voices in taking this discussion forward? I think at this point in time, I should invite Tom to actually tell us what exactly the next step could be, because they have been running this series of webinars where communities are involved. And I think maybe we can extend this, this debate, this conversation, and invite more players, more partners, and continue the discussion. Tom?
Thank you, Arun. Thank you for those words. Excellent. I concur with you that immensely rich conversation, extremely wide range that we have captured today. And I feel that, yes, we must definitely move forward dialoguing this. At this level, I think it's more at the level of donors, NGOs, etc. We must expand it, and also experts. We must also expand to include community in this conversation. I think one of the thoughts, just to add on to what was already being said, I think the world was rapidly moving towards what was, making things which were earlier illegitimate and gray as the new normal, and data privacy is not an exception. So in that larger context of kind of data privacy, and I here want to make one distinction between data security and data privacy, which often tends to be used as an excuse to legitimize data privacy or violate data privacy. Like the famous argument of the proponents of Aadhaar saying that if you can give it to iPhone, why don't you give it to the government? There is a very clear distinction between data security and data privacy. In a digital world, I feel that data security is almost like a pipe dream. Many of you have said aggregation doesn't matter. You can always disaggregate. You can identify data and so on and so forth. So I think the space we are fighting, whether it is in the donor circle, community legitimacy, or in the government sphere, is the space where what the data is used for is the space that we are fighting. What it can be used for, what it cannot be used for. And that is the space where I think rightfully Ingrid pointed out Ambedkar's call to educate, agitate, and organize. And that's a space I think we must occupy at the political level. When you come to the donor-donee community kind of relationship, I think since it is founded on the principle of not just accountability, but also transparency. Because of that, I feel that the starting point must be dialogue. And dialogue is often taken for granted, but then it seldom happens. So I think that dialogue is what we must definitely create when you come to donor space and the community space. And at the political level, I think definitely the Ambedkar axiom, that's what moving forward we must look at. In the dialogue, as I was saying in the beginning, Arun, I think we must also now start to bring community perspectives and how those voices can also be heard. It's both at the level of, engaging with the community in a way that they are able to make informed choices, not just, be coerced into accepting, as I think Jacob was mentioning, how ready are the communities to give you consent, the informed consent bit. So if you could engage more, I think bringing in community also, I think that would be a good way forward. Wonderful again. Thank you so much for those great insights from all of you. And I do hope that we can continue this conversation and bring in some, I think, structured ways in which at least the donor-donee community relationship dialogues can happen, particularly when it comes to data privacy. At least that's within our sphere of greater influence. And we must at least start there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Arun. I think that's a lovely way to end. And I'm sure that the conversations that we started today will continue. We will have more rounds of discussions and we will have more debates on this. And that is only needed given the current situation that we are in. Thank you, everyone. It's been really nice. It's been really great that we had this opportunity to organize this webinar and pull it off. Thank you to everyone who joined. Thank you to the panelists, especially for your time and for making the great points that you did. We can now close for the day. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.